Hello, welcome to Conway Video. So I just want to dedicate a whole video to documentation. Yes, the whole idea of documentation, of writing things down. Documentation, technical documentation specifically. Documenting how a system works, maybe a little bit why it works that way. I think it's an art and a science and a valuable skill, and to some degree maybe underrated at times. I have seen it overrated too, though, so I don't want to be too far on the side of it being underrated. There are times and places where documentation probably has gone a bit too far, but I would say generally it's underrated. Now I'm a bit biased here generally, all right? I admit that one of my earliest formative experiences when I was growing up was documentation. Specifically, my parents owned a Mazda 626. It's a classic car that you might remember, a classic family sedan back in the day, back in the 90s. Not so long ago, but long ago for me. And that manual of that car, I loved reading the instruction manual. I loved the diagrams. I loved how everything was kind of neatly laid out. I loved how the diagram had numbers all through it, and you could look at the text associated with the numbers and read a little paragraph or a sentence about each part of the car. I loved how it was broken down into sections. So there were sections of the car that operated together. There was the lighting system in the car. There was the whole sort of engine system. There was the braking system. And so the documentation had this information architecture to it, where each section was kind of broken down into subsections, and then those sections were broken down into subsections, and then the diagrams all throughout it were very clear and precise, and there were numbers as well, and measurements of things, and ranges of things. It was a little bit like a user interface in a way. You had like different kind of formats for different parts of the manual. So if you had something about I don't know, the range of the volume control knob on the stereo system, then you would have a little diagram that actually showed you how loud and how quiet that volume control could go. So it was a really fun manual to read. I think you can even get the PDF of that manual online somewhere. I probably should look it up and post a link. But yeah, no, I really grew up loving that manual. So I guess I've grown up with a bit of a bias toward documentation. But here's why I think documentation is important. Code is structured in a certain way. The structure of code is not arbitrary. You can't structure code the way that you want to structure it, right? We often think we can. We often say that code is just code. You can change it, and anything can change. It's just code after all. I mean, it's just text in a file. Anyone can go in and change it. But when you think a little bit more deeply about that, you realize, well, that's not really true. You can't just change any character in a Java file or a JavaScript file for that matter. You can't. If you change something that causes the compiler to fail the code, then you won't be able to build, and you won't be able to deploy, and that will be a major nightmare. Or if you change something and the code does compile, you might cause a logic error, and that might break the code. Obviously, code is code. We can't just change whatever we want. We can't organize it the way we want either. When the code is set up a certain way, then you can't just take a module out of this folder and just shove it in this folder. A whole bunch of things are going to be referencing that module. You have to change the references. And then what if changing those references causes some confusion for some other team who are also expecting that file to be in the same place? So you can't just move code around. You can't organize it the way that you think. The code is organized with a number of constraints taken into account, which are much more than just the logic of what you're trying to do. The code is structured around the frameworks you're using. So a React code base is necessarily structured in a certain kind of way, or an Angular code base is structured in a certain kind of way. So whichever framework you're using is going to enforce some kind of standards about how you structure your files. A React code base, generally the files have a TSX or a JSX extension, and that generally there's a certain way that the folders are structured and so on. It's the same with Java, .NET, and so on. So you've got the framework and the tools and the programming language. That's one. Number two is that you've already got a whole structure there that other people are looking at. So other people are using this code base, so you can't just go moving files around and changing things. Other people are going to get confused, right? Number three, you have maybe coding standards in your organization. So the organization might have a standard about how things are set out, and you can't just violate that standard. So already there's 3 constraints. I'm sure you can think of more, but there's already 3 constraints as to how code has to be structured and written a certain way. Now, if code is like that, then how are you going to document that code? It's not so easy. If you have a concept, one concept that appears in 5 different files across the whole code base, all sprinkled around, then those are 5 different files, right? Who is going to know that those 5 files represent that one thing? Where is that going to be stored? Where are you going to put it? Are you going to put it in a file somewhere that no one's going to find? Are you going to put it in a big, huge, enormous README file somewhere that, again, no one's going to find? Where are you going to put that concept? The logical place to put that is in documentation, and preferably documentation that that doesn't have to be kept in the same organizational structure as the code is. Now, there are some people who say the code should document itself, or everything that about the code should be with the code that it's about. I think that's a good thing in theory. In theory, it would be nice if our code was set up in such a beautiful, perfect, ideal way that everything was separate from everything else in just the right way. We had cohesion rather than coupling. We had perfectly perfectly decomposed modules. That would be perfect. I'll link to a paper about how you decompose things. I mean, that was a very correct paper, and there is definitely a way, a better and a worse way that you can compose code. But again, let's remind ourselves, we're talking about an ideal. We're talking about the way a perfect code base would be. Most code bases aren't like that. Most code bases are structured in almost the worst possible way, because all the incentives are against structuring them well in some companies. But then even if the incentives are for structuring the code well, you have all kinds of other constraints. As I mentioned, you've got frameworks, tools, programming languages, you've got the way the team thinks, and then you've even got also things like speed. Sometimes a company had to move so fast and build something so quickly, they just didn't have time to sit back and really do the perfect job and plan it properly. So given that most code bases are disorganized and most code bases are going to have one concept sprinkled through so many different files, where are you going to put that knowledge and that concept? The best place is documentation, and that documentation should sit outside the code base, and it should sit in somewhere like a wiki. We've got wiki tools like Confluence or WikiWeb, or there's any number of tools that you can find that will do this, even just simple Google Docs, a folder structure. So the documentation should be outside the code. Anyone should be able to edit it and change it and move it around. And the attitude of the team toward the documentation should be permission, ask forgiveness rather than permission. Instead of people kind of sitting back and not wanting to touch the documentation and treating it like some sort of sacred tome, no, people should jump in and edit it. And then, if someone doesn't like it, they can disagree, and there can be a whole discussion, a dialogue. And that way the documentation becomes an active, dynamic thing that everyone is involved in. It shouldn't be something where there's someone who kind of guards the documentation tightly and no one else is able to edit it, right? That's the old way of working. That's like source safe days, right? We don't want to go back to Microsoft source safe, for goodness sakes. We've learned better ways than that. No, we want to go to documentation that anyone can jump in and edit, that everyone can see, that is shared. And the documentation, unlike code, is arbitrary. It is, you can change documentation without breaking anything. Hopefully. You should not have anything that breaks when you change documentation. That's just a general baseline rule. So, you've got documentation, you've got a Confluence with a bunch of pages in it, or you've got Google Docs, or you've got a shared folder with, Word documents in it, whatever, take your pick. Have all your documentation in one place. Then in the documentation, then you can organize things. And the beauty is you can find one concept, give it a name, give it a good meaty paragraph that describes what it is and what it does. That thing can describe a huge amount of code. That thing could describe 5 different modules in your project, which all use that same concept. But because you've got that concept in one place, there's one place that someone has to look. And the way that they can look is you can give them a link. If someone asks you a question, you can say, hey, check the documentation, here's the link. And no, you don't have to give them one link that has a 50,000 page file that they have to churn through in their spare time. No, it can be one link to one short, concise page that describes the concept, and that person will never ask you that question again because now they know where to look. And the next time they get a question in their head and they want to come and bother you on Slack or Messenger or whatever you're using, then tell them to go search the wiki for that keyword, and then they will probably never bother you again in your life. And if you keep the documentation up to date, so you can send them off to look it up in the docs. And if your docs are well written, I'm going to do some other videos on documentation, but if your documentation is well written, people will read it. I think if you have a problem of people asking each other lots of questions and not looking at the documentation, it's probably because the documentation is pretty lousy. You probably need to improve the documentation a bit. I can give some tips on that later, but I guess the point of this whole video is documentation is really good and really important, and developers should probably be good at writing documentation because let's just face it, our code is never going to be self-documenting. It's just not going to happen in most companies. When we get to maybe in 5 or 10 years, when the industry is way better and all of our practices are perfect and we do TDD every time and we all have read the paper on decomposition and we all know how to create good software architectures, maybe then we don't need to worry about documentation. But for the time being, we need documentation because code is not self-documenting. Code is complicated as hell, and it's structured in a way that doesn't lend itself to documentation. It's structured in a way that is to do with a lot of different constraints, including frameworks and tools and languages. And so you need a place to put the knowledge, the way the knowledge is structured, the way the knowledge is structured, not the way the code has to be structured. And that is documentation. And developers, we should be good at documentation. This isn't a job for business analysts and project managers and that. They should do it too, but we should be good at documentation for our own sake, so that we can document things, so that we can understand how something works and share it with other people in the team and be able to work with it properly. So anyway, that's my little spiel / rant on documentation. Go document.